Welcome everyone to the June 4th, 2018 Kubernetes SIG Apps weekly meeting. This week we do have an agenda where we're going to be focusing on developer tools. Into chat here, I will paste, this is the agenda and any notes we have. Anybody who wants to help take notes along the way, please feel free. My name is Matt Farina. I'm chairing today. For the announcements, there's kind of two things we wanted to talk about. One is, for those of you who haven't seen it, Helm joined the CNCF as a top-level project alongside Kubernetes, Prometheus, and others. There is an announcement there. If you start tracking around, there's lots of links on it. That means that things like Charts, Monocular, Chart Museum, Helm, and all of that stuff is now technically out of SIG Apps ownership. We'll have to go around and update a few things and move stuff around. That'll happen in the coming weeks. And so it will now just be like any other project. All these things will be like any other projects that come here and just talk about the app developer space and the app operator space, just like everything else, because it's no longer owned by SIG Apps. Does anybody have any questions about this? Awesome. I will take silence as none. If you do want to have private questions or discussions on it, please feel free to reach out and let me know. The other thing is there is a CAP out that we would like folks to go take a review of. That is the deployment controllers in place upgrade. This CAP is a Kubernetes enhancement proposal. And this is one of the things that they're looking at to continue to improve on some of our core controllers. And so if folks are interested in in-place upgrades and deployments, please go take a look at that and give your 2 cents. And then with that, and the link for that is in the meeting minutes. Then with that, we have Brian, I think I saw you're on to demo CaseOnIt and what you've been up to.
Yeah, I'm here.
Can you share your screen?
Yeah, give me 1 second. And I will share my screen. All right, let's see. Desktop. All right. So everyone can see my screen, correct?
We can.
All right, so I'll go ahead and get started. So I'm here today to talk about CaseOnIt. I'm Brian Lyles from Heptio. And we're working on CaseOnIt, which is a declarative configuration management tool for Kubernetes. And we don't actually talk about it much in public, but that is changing. And I'm thankful that Matt invited us to actually do this today. So give me 2 seconds here and we will get started. So what I'm going to do, this is all demo, but to get started, what I want to show you is I created 3 slides in Keynote, and I just want to just preface the discussion with this. So what is a CaseOnIt app? You know, this term is interesting, and sometimes it's hard to understand. So really, what we're trying to do is we're bundling this concept of a CaseOnIt configuration, which is arbitrary and not very important for this discussion. And then there's this Kubernetes environments. We're able to describe Kubernetes environments. And then what we're able to do is take this thing called CaseOnIt Lib, which I'll talk about a little bit later, and its external dependencies. And then what we do is we combine all those together with your configurations as well, and we create Kubernetes objects. And that's really what CaseOnIt is. CaseOnIt is named after JSONIT, which we use quite a bit. JSONIT is really, it's a language that is also a superset of JSON. So a valid JSON document is valid JSONIT, but it also gives you functions and conditionals and all sorts of neat things. So let's talk about what CaseOnIt is, and actually let's just use it and see how it works. So what I'm going to do is we're going to start this all fresh. So CaseOnIt has a binary, it's called KS, and we're going to create one here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell it to use Kubernetes namespace demo1 that I've already created. And we're going to create an environment inside of CaseOnIt called demo1. So they'll just be the same. And what have we created here? Well, let's go into this directory and we look at it. we create a few different directories and a few different files. And I'll just go through these real quick. An app.yaml file, this is the configuration for your CaseOnIt app. It tells us what's in there and how it's all put together. And then we have components. Components describe Kubernetes objects. And in a component file can be one-to-many, one-to-one. But just think about all the things that you want in your Kubernetes cluster will exist in this components directory. Inside of this directory is also a params.libsonit file. That is parameters or values for your components. These are the defaults. And then next below here is environments. And notice we created this demo one. So what this does is describe the environment, describes where the cluster is. It describes how to combine environment level parameters, which will override component level parameters. And then below there's something called lib. And this is our CaseOnIt Lib, which I will go into a little bit later. But really what CaseOnIt Lib is it's a conversion of Kubernetes schema for a particular version, and in this case, 1.9.6 into JSONIT. That's important whenever you want to do some interesting things with Kubernetes in the future. And then there's also vendor. And vendor is for external dependencies. And we'll look at some of those as well. So we're inside of our app. What can we do? So first thing we probably want to do is create some objects. And one thing that CaseOnIt does is it actually gives you some samples to start off with. So if you wanted to create a config map or a service and a deployment or a namespace or just a deployment and a service by yourself, we have code generators that will actually do that for you. So what do those actually look like? So we can use this KS prototype command to describe, and we'll just do deployed service because this one is the most comprehensive. And what it does is it takes a few arguments, and what it'll do is it creates a deployment and a service. But what does that look like? So before you have to commit to this thing, what we can do is we can actually preview it. And what I'm doing in this example is I'm previewing a deployed service prototype, which is just an example, some generated code, and I'm going to give it the name app1, and I'm going to give it an image with image::tag. That's not real, but it works for this because it's only a preview. So what does it create? So if we go from the top to the bottom, there's some local variables that are created inside the JSONIT, and then below this, we've created an array. And in this array, there's two Kubernetes objects. There's a service, and below that, there is actually a deployment. And what will happen is CaseOnIt will see this array. It'll say, oh, there's two objects in here, and it will do whatever it needs to do to get them deployed to the cluster. So now let's go ahead and actually create this inside of our application. So in this example, oops. There, try some more time. Chaos generate. There we go. So in this example, what I'm doing is I'm creating a deployment and a service, and I'm going to title it Guestbook UI, and I'm going to give it a real image. And this is just the demo image that we've been using at Heptio. Ultimately, it shows this guestbook, but we're not going to be running it really, so it's just an image. So if we go inside of our app and we review it and we look at it, we'll see what we've generated here. And so what we've created are two things. One, we've created this guestbook UI, which looks just like the prototype we saw before. And we've also created some parameters that we can use as defaults. And the way that these are used is by lines like this params line. So since we've imported it right here, we can actually use this params, and we're using params name all over these two things here, all over these two objects. And what we then get is we have components. So we're really trying to focus on the command line with CaseOnIt. So I created this component, and now I get this list. When I list my components, I can see it there. But what I also can do is list my parameters. And I can see these are the knobs that I can actually adjust to change how my object will be rendered. So Now, we have this component here, but really what we want is we want to be able to apply it to an environment which represents a Kubernetes namespace on a cluster. So when we created this application, we created a default environment. And for this particular example, this particular time, I fired up Kubernetes or Docker for Mac and its Kubernetes cluster, and it's a 1.96 version, and it sits on localhost. This is just on my machine. So whenever we want to actually look at when we actually want to generate Kubernetes objects, we need to generate them off of a cluster. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to show my demo one environment, and what it's going to do, and I'll just show you here, is it's going to take that JSONIT code that's over here, do all the parameter substitution, do whatever else it needs to do, and it creates two Kubernetes objects. And one neat thing about this is that you can actually, if you're into JSON as well, we will export it as JSON. And notice that we wrap it in a Kubernetes list because you can't have multiple files unless they're sitting in some kind of array. So that's what CaseOnIt is. But that's only slightly interesting. Now, where do we get to the part where CaseOnIt becomes interesting? Well, the first thing I want to show you is that CaseOnIt knows what you have locally, but it can also query the cluster to see what you have on the remote. So one thing we can do is I can actually diff the environments. So I want to look at my local environment, and I want to look at my remote environment. And what's the difference between these? Well, actually everything, because we haven't applied anything yet. And so what this was telling me is that whenever I run apply from CaseOnIt the next time, it's actually going to do all these things. It's going to create these new objects and all these lines. So I'll go ahead and do that. And notice here that it actually says, hey, I'm trying to create this service called Guestbook UI, and this deployment Guestbook UI, and they didn't exist, so I'm creating them. So CaseOnIt will actually apply to the cluster for you. So, getting more interesting. But here's something else that CaseOnIt can do. So we have our parameters, like we were talking about before, and they are all separate from the configuration. Well, we can change them. So I can actually do something like ks-param set guestbook UI, and what we'll do here is we'll change the default replicas to 2. And right here, so now my default is my replicas are now 2. So if I do ks diff, you'll notice that if I were going to apply this again, that my replicas would now be 2. It'll tell me exactly what it's going to change. So we'll just go ks apply demo 1. It's only it says it's updating both, but it's really only updating the deployment. So with CaseOnIt, we know that applications exist in multiple environments. So here's the next thing we're going to show. So now we're going to actually go ksm add, and we'll create this this new demo 2 environment. So we'll say that demo 1 is development or staging, and we'll say demo 2 is our production. So now what we can do is we can actually diff and apply to different environments. And we can actually have parameters that actually live only on certain environments. So a good example for this would be before, remember when we set the ksm set, or sorry, ks-param set, we set the default to 2. Well, what about in production, we want it to be 4? Oops. We want the numbers because this is our production workload. It's going to get more traffic, so we can actually do that. So now, whenever we apply to demo 1, we're actually in our dev or staging. We're going to get the small amount of replicas, but whenever we apply this thing to our production, we actually get 4. So that was just a quick overview of that. I'm gonna move on to two more quick things here. So Kubernetes or CaseOnIt also supports YAML. We actually support YAML as a first-class thing. Let me give you an example of what I mean. So just a lot of people go out to the internet and what they do here is they find YAML created by someone else. So in this case, it's something off the Kubernetes doc site. It's actually just a deployment that was created. Well, what we can do is now we can actually we can import this YAML into our application. So there's two things happening here. One, I'm downloading this YAML, looking inside of it, and creating, splitting it up and creating different files for every single object I find in there. And the second thing is that I've also put it in a different location inside of my components. Now, why would we want to do that? Well, we believe that applications are complex, and applications across enterprises can build lots of different things. So we're allowing you to separate the components of your application from other parts. So we have the YAML here, but we separated it from our guest book, so you can actually operate on them differently. But another thing we can do is we can actually operate them on the environment level. Okay, so demo 1. So now what we've done is we said that, hey, our application has multiple modules in it. It has one with our guestbook UI and also one with our Nginx. And then we can operate on those together now. So if I do KS apply demo 1, it's going to now add that in there. And why do we do that? Well, the reason why is because, like I was saying before, inside of a typical Kubernetes cluster, you could have something like Cert Manager, or Prometheus, or let's say Contour from Heptio. But then also you might have App 1, App 2, App 3, App 4, and App 5. You don't always want to deploy all those together, and dev teams should have the flexibility to be able to apply those in whatever way they need. So CaseOnIt will allow you to build those constructs and put them together. So here's another feature. One other thing that we can do is, even though we're accepting YAML, what we can do is we can modify parameters for YAML. So here's a good example where I'm actually setting a new metadata annotation called foo with a value of bar on this new on this YAML, and I'm not changing the YAML itself. This is still the same, but I'm saying the parameters are changed. So whenever I do ks show demo 1, what's going to happen is CaseOnIt's going to realize, hey, we want to actually update that thing whenever we're rendering it out, so we can have overlays on top of a YAML, and we can do it for new or existing values. All right. So the next thing I said I'm talking about at the beginning is this thing called CaseOnIt Lib. And CaseOnIt and CaseOnIt Lib are two different things. Like I said, CaseOnIt Lib is a conversion of the Kubernetes schema that's in JSON to CaseOnIt, or to JSONIT. Now, why would you want to do that? Well, here's a good example. Let's say we have objects and we have deployments. And deployments, we really want to be able to just apply node affinities to our deployments. So what I could do is I could actually go into this source and go down here and set up my node affinity. But with CaseOnIt Lib, actually knowing how CaseOnIt or how Kubernetes works, there's actually a much easier way of doing this, or actually a better way, a more maintainable way. So I'm going to type some commands here. And the first thing I'm doing is adding an external dependency. So if I do ks registry list, and I'm adding this new thing that I created called CaseOnIt container, and then I'm going to do ks package list, and I have this new package called KSC scheduling installed. So ks package install KSC scheduling. Now I have this library inside of my application. So if I look in vendor, I have this thing inside of my application where I have this library. So now I can actually take advantage of this library. And let me show you how I can do this. So I'm going to actually change this object without actually touching this object. So this is a little bit more advanced, but this is something that we are trying to teach people how to do, how to do it. And instead of actually typing it in, I'm going to cut and paste because I am not a great typer. And so we've imported this thing into our library. And what we're going to do here is we're going to take this whole deployment object out of here, and we're going to go, we're just going to put it right here, local deployment equals that thing we just pasted. And then we're just going to go down here. And then what we're going to do is we're going to change our object. So we're going to do D with A, and that's deployment with affinities. And what we're going to do is we're just going to add a new affinity. And if I were to type this out, there actually is, we actually wrote a CaseOnIt plugin for VS Code, so there actually is documentation for this. So I've now created this new deployment, this D with A, and what it does is it actually just puts a node affinity in there. And whenever I render this out, what you're going to see is I didn't change anything inside my code, but CaseOnIt Lib was able to actually go inside there and make the node affinity right where it needed to be. We could do this many times, and there's lots of different options there. So now I'm going to take this advantage, and Matt, I'm only going to take 3 more minutes. But I want to show this because I think this is so important for this group. We are super into embracing the community at Heptio. You know, we have people who actually, we have 2/3 of the founders of Kubernetes. I've been tasked to not only just make CaseOnIt, but figure out better ways for people to interact inside the Kubernetes ecosystem when it comes to applications. So back last month, I mentioned, hey, CaseOnIt is going to support Helm. And what I'm getting ready to show you is not production quality yet, but I want to be held to my promise. So I am going to show you CaseOnIt Helm integration. And because it's not all integrated in, what I'm going to have to do is cut and paste because I don't have a tool that will actually add a CaseOnIt repo yet, or I mean how to add a Helm repo. So the first thing I'm doing here is I'm going to my configuration and I'm changing the YAML to actually add a new registry called Helm-stable, which points to the Helm stable repo. So if I do KS registry list, we get that one. Let me save it real here, quick here. Oh no, I messed up a line. All right, we'll just get rid of all. We'll just get rid of all these. Oh, who's drawing on my screen? It's not nice. All right, so we've added this new we've added this new registry. So now, whenever I do a KS package list, not only do I get what's built in, but I can actually see all the Helm charts that are in Helm stable as packages for CaseOnIt. So which means I can do KS package install Helm, and we're just going to do Redis. And what it does is it downloads Redis into our environment here. So let's actually create a Helm module or Helm component for Kubernetes for CaseOnIt. So I'll just call this one Helm Redis.jsonit. And what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to paste in this code for time. And what it does is it makes, what we're doing is we're actually tying in Helm configuration with CaseOnIt configuration. So let me show you how this works. So I'm actually using CaseOnIt to configure Helm. So I'll tell you this while I'm actually doing this. Microsoft's had some wins today, but cutting and pasting out of OneNote is not one they had. So now, whenever I do a KS show demo 1, I'm using Helm to actually render the templates that were involved in the chart, and I'm actually can do some neat things, like I can actually say, hey, CaseOnIt, KS param set Helm-Redis. So slave count, bad word for the cluster, but whenever I do this, I can actually update Helm values with CaseOnIt parameters. And I'll show you, just go back so we can actually see that replica line. It's somewhere in here. But we actually, I'm not even going to do that, but we can merge CaseOnIt parameters with Helm values to provide the proper values. So which means that in a lot of cases, we will be able to support Helm charts with no changes at all, and it'll be first-class things inside of CaseOnIt. So that was a quick demo. I could probably do this for an hour because I missed over a lot of things, but I just wanted to show you that what CaseOnIt provides. And really what we're trying to do is have declarative configuration, which basically says what you have on disk, once you apply it to the cluster, that's what it is. There are no conditionals, there's nothing like that. That is what it is. And there's no guessing or templating or anything like that. So that's what I wanted to show you all today. Thanks. I will take questions. I actually did not see the chat because I'm in full screen mode here. But if you have some, either reach out to us on CaseOnIt on the Kubernetes Slack, or send me email, bryan@heptio.com, tweet, mention CaseOnIt, I'll see it. But we want your input because we think this is a great idea for managing complex configurations in Kubernetes. So that's all I have. Thank you.
Brian, thank you for sharing. And I'm sorry I couldn't remove those annotation lines. I was trying to figure it out, and for some reason it wouldn't let me. We're going to have to go figure out how a host can do that because it's, I don't know, very strange, one of the Zoom things. So thank you. Did anybody have any questions? There were no questions in the chat text. So I have some, but I want to know, does anybody else have anything they want to speak up about? All right, there's nothing. In that case, I do have a few things. So I was trying to categorize things. One of the things Brian Grant has been trying to do is categorize some of the tools and some of the things that they categorize in things like the CNCF landscape and stuff like that. We're talking about categorization of tools. And I kind of picked 5 things. And I'm wondering if you'd say this list is right. Application definition, configuration management, or maybe 4 things. Dependency handling and the whole space around dependencies and registries. And as part of that, you have overlays in there, which are probably part of more the config management. Would you kind of say that's the general space CaseOnIt is targeting?
Yeah, that is. Yes.
Okay.
And then I'd add one more. Well, no, that's so not only overlays, but trying to allow you to create more complex configurations than you would by writing them by hand. So I don't know what that category is called, but that's another thing that we're trying to do.
Okay, that makes sense. So I noticed you talked in there about focusing on the command line for the tool. Have you thought about JSON outputs as one of the ways of getting output so other tools can wrap it and build other complex things on it and interact in a machine way? Because I'll tell you.
So yeah, actually, CaseOnIt is built to ultimately work in a GitOps pipeline. So that means that command lines for everything. We have an effort right now to do JSON output from every single command. There are certain commands that do support it, like you can list parameters or a few other things and you can get JSON output, but I really want everything to have JSON output. So it can operate as it, because CaseOnIt isn't an endpoint, it's a journey tool. So you will only use it on the journey. So we do want to make sure that we're integrating with other things that are doing things upstream. And one other thing I did not mention is that we are actually, we're setting up to do linting. And we would love to be able to even work as a linting thing where you could actually get JSON coming into CaseOnIt. We could say, hey, you know what? Hey, this RBAC, this cluster stuff right here, this cluster RBAC configuration is basically giving you roots. We're just going to say, hey, it's giving you roots, and then move on, and you can decide what you want to do with it. So we're not the beginning of the journey, we're not the end of the journey, but we want to make the journey nicer.
Okay. I noticed in there that your target was Kubernetes, I think 1.9. Was it 4 or 6?
It's 6.
And that's the library version that was there. What if you're dealing with multiple different versions of Kubernetes? Maybe you've got 1.9.6, and then on another cluster you've got 1.10.
So CaseOnIt actually, so when it detects whenever it goes out to your cluster, what it will do is figure out the version, and it'll generate a CaseOnIt Lib for that version. So if you touch 1.9.6, it'll generate that. And if there's another environment that's 1.10.2, it'll generate that.
Okay.
It can actually, it'll actually work with multiple. So any number above 1.8 is where we're targeting right now. But above 1.8, we can handle all versions of Kubernetes.
Well, 1.8 isn't even a supported version of Kubernetes anymore. So you're going back. All right.
But not in Kubernetes land, but in the real world, yeah, people are still using it.
They are. It's just an unsupported version for security and all those wonderful things.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
All right. No, thank you. Did anybody else have any other questions before we move on? All right, silence. Thanks, Brian.
I just want to say one last thing is that we look at the ecosystem as, you know, a whole big thing, and we see all the contributions from all these great projects. We're just realizing that it is going to take all of us together to make something great, and your organization is going to need its own cocktail of apps to make it successful. We just want to be in part of more of those and help people, help make this thing approachable to more people. So we're just happy to be a part of the environment.
All right, thank you. So the next topic we had up was discussion, and we were going to do developer tools. That's one of the things that we've talked about doing, is looking at developer tools every other week. And this week it's to chat about that. And we've got a couple of points that have been written in here to kick off the discussion. The first one is kind of just an open question of what tools are missing in your toolbox. So I'm not sure who actually put these two things in there, but I'll go in there and just ask the question. So if you're a developer out there, and we yes.
That was me. This is Kim Lewandowski. So I added those added those 2 points to the list today, and they're very general questions. But to be honest, I'm still trying to figure out like the best use of everyone's time in these weekly meetings. I think one of the things is it's hard because I don't know everyone in the room or what their backgrounds are or what they're interested in, and it's very possible you've discussed this topic before. So I just kind of want to put that out there too. Like, it would be interesting to see how we might, I don't know, get background information from people or something. I know there you have all of the history of all these meetings, which I have not had time to go back and look at, but just putting it out there, like, how can we learn more about each other to figure out what people are actually interested in and make these meetings like as productive as possible for everyone.
So, Kim.
Yes.
Can you guys hear me? One thing that, one piece of advice I would give is that just because we may have visited a topic before doesn't mean it's not important to revisit it, because Kubernetes changes so much that the opinions of a topic 6 months ago might be very, very different from the opinions of a topic today. So I wouldn't like let the fact that a topic may have been discussed before prevent you from bringing that up if it's an important topic to discuss now.
Sure, that's fair.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. Besides the survey where people gave, in which we didn't even, I don't think we explicitly asked what tools were missing, but I'd have to go back and look and get hints from it from the survey. I don't know if we have that. And you know, quite frankly, it's one of those interesting conversation topics too, right? Because one of the things we used to say was missing was validation tools. And because people couldn't discover the validation tools out there, there are actually a bunch of validation tools now that many of them work in a very similar way because it wasn't necessarily discoverable. And so that space can kind of be maybe overkilled now. And some other people, because of its discoverability, may still not know about all these validation tools. And so I think this is kind of a good question because it highlights discoverability, how information sharing is going on, holes and maybe features in those holes. So I kind of like this question. And you know, it's worth it if folks want to speak up now, maybe just start rattling off some things like what are things that are missing in your toolbox?
One thing I'd like to see a bit more of is either end-to-end app testing. I've seen some talk around Helm test. What other tools are people finding, or what's the consensus for end-to-end driving applications as they're developed, similar to the EDE test for Kubernetes? I asked this because I'm trying to work on some snooping, API snoop for the Kubernetes API, and I would love to see what our community is actually using and some sample data so that as we write our test, we can go and see what other people are doing, both to benefit our own test writing and for the centralized EDE testing on Kubernetes.
Yeah, this topic came up a few times at KubeCon. I was doing a mini cube session down here, and a whole bunch of people were trying to use it for integration testing in CI environments, and we have any really good tools for doing the actual integration tests themselves. That's how to do it. Bash script. Looking for advice on what to do here.
Okay, yeah. So I guess I'll go on this track. So, and others can jump in too. One of the things that I've seen here when it comes to the end-to-end testing that isn't really uncommon is for in a CI pipeline. In fact, this is even how we do the community charts, right? The Helm community charts is we'll go create a namespace. We'll go spin up an application in that namespace in our development environment, and then we'll run a myriad of tests on it and tear it down. Sometimes, like on a project I used to work on, for the life of a pull request, we'd keep that environment up and keep updating it. Other times it's torn down right after the test run. It kind of depends on the practical things that you're doing, right? Because if you need to go share that PR with other people, you want to keep it up for longer, like if you're doing a web app or something like that. And so there's a lot of different characteristics of this, but I've seen this in, I mean, just in the last year, I've seen 3 or 4 environments that I've personally touched where it's that same kind of flow of a pull request to a namespace where you stand up the application in and then tear it down. And it just depends on how long it lives there. I remember in one case, we were doing so many of them and was actually standing up a logging solution that we ended up killing our disk system. So it teaches a lot of things down the stack that you might need in your cluster because it was a logging system and we were logging so much stuff and we had so many pull requests open at the same time that we're all logging and writing to disk that we had issues. But that's just one example. I don't know, others may have something as well.
So, and this is, I know I just talked about CaseOnIt for 20 minutes, but there's 2 things inside of CaseOnIt. The first thing is we actually, like I said before, we want to be a part of your pipeline. We validate all the, there's a CaseOnIt command for validating, making sure that, hey, this thing is valid. That it can actually be inserted in the cluster. And then there's another project that probably will be separated out from CaseOnIt is the CaseOnIt end-to-end test. And what that is that it can just run a workload and it can exercise the crap out of that workload. So from soup to nuts, basically. I don't know how, I know some people from CNCF have reached out for us to help them out with that project, to be a part of other projects they have, but we like that kind of input, and we would love to be a part of any of these discussions around that.
Okay. Yeah.
One thing on validation, client-side validation, depending on who you talk to, is actively discouraged due to version skew issues that have bitten us in the past. Now that mainly applies to kubectl or kubectl, however you guys want to pronounce it. And I've never been a hardliner on that myself, just because I think client-side validation is probably very valuable to users. And the API server doesn't necessarily give you a good way to round trip something to determine strict validation without actually having to apply the command. So like, I don't know what to do for validation. If you have on one side, like pressure from the API machinery side, don't do client-side validation, it's brittle. But on the other side, you don't have a dry run command to determine what the effects of your actual command are. It's kind of still up in the air. Now, I know as part of the server-side apply, they're trying to work on a dry run command to allow a generic way for clients to do validation against a cluster. But I don't even know when that'll be available. So, and people want to be able to dry run a command without, well, users need a way to dry run a command to try to determine if it will succeed or not. So, super complicated.
Yeah, but I think some of this is getting into the app operation, right? So when I tested it, I'm pretty sure my config is going to go spin up my stuff, and that's going to be the least of my problems. I'm then working on features with my application. So say it's a website, right? I may want to go run cross-browser testing and use something that runs a bunch of analysis across different browsers. Or, you know, maybe I'm doing React and I want to run some kind of React integration tests or something like that. Or maybe I've got 2 services and I want to make sure that all the APIs are talking and I've actually stood up these services. But it's all about the app code at this point, right? I'm usually going to assume that we got the Kubernetes config right and we're spinning this up and pull requests or stuff many times a day. And so the Kubernetes config isn't the problem and the operation isn't the problem. I'm now going to say, now that I've got this thing up, I want to go fire off some other tests against this that are app related, right? Maybe it's an API server. And so now I'm going to say, is the integration working for other outside clients and tools? And I'll pull in some other client and tool. Maybe I'm doing a container native CI pipeline, right? And the next step before I go tear down my PR is to say, I'm going to grab one of these outside tools I expect to integrate with it, and I'm going to just test it and make sure the whole integration works, right? Because that other tool works. And then once I've now tested my app logic more so than anything about the cluster, right? It's running in the cluster and it keeps the config going, but you've kind of tested that more real world situation. Maybe I'm going to go do scalability testing, right? Maybe I'll go hit it with some tool that's just going to smatter it. And maybe this is just a once a day thing where I just go beat up on it and see how many HTTP requests it can handle and make sure that it scales and the kind of configuration and the performance I expect works. But that's more so app config and just having an environment to CI that in than Kubernetes related. And that's one of the things that I've seen elsewhere is looking at how can I spin it up in that environment and then use other things on it that have nothing to do with Kubernetes or operations, but are kind of targeting those app features to give me app insights, if that makes sense.
So it does, but one thing that I've seen, I guess, from looking at the last two KubeCons and then talking to users, it seems like CI in particular and testing in particular is very near and dear to every organization's heart. And they all build their own bespoke system. Like there isn't a standard thing. So almost everyone is building their own bespoke thing. There's nothing standard, and they all, well, a large fraction of them tend to use Jenkins somewhere along the line. CD, maybe if you look at Weaveflux and CodeShip, there are things out there that I wouldn't say are standard, but are popular at least and used by many people for continuous deployment. But the integration piece, the smoke testing piece, the scalability testing piece, stressing, there's no standard across the community that I've seen emerging at least.
No, and a lot of it is just get it up and then use existing tools. Like if I want to load test something, there's tools out there to do it. I just need to, get it into an environment where I can load test it and then run an existing load test tool on it and be able to pass those parameters around. And a lot of systems do it. Now, one of the things you might find interesting here is when we're looking at the app survey, if you took Jenkins and then you took alongside of it all the other cloud native ones, right? GitLab CI, Drone, Concourse, the other ones that use containers and pipelines to do it, besides Jenkins, there were slightly more of those in use than Jenkins if you combine them. Now, I don't know how many people are using 2 of them or 3 different systems depending on what they're doing, but where Jenkins kind of has dominated that space, there's a whole bunch of other players that are doing essentially the same kinds of things with slight differences, and they've actually grown to be a sizable chunk of space. That kind of surprised me when I added them all up. So I don't know if this kind of answered the questions of what tools are missing. We kind of went down to the end-to-end test route. Are there any other tools that folks wanted to talk about? Any other gaps that people are experiencing or seeing?
Yeah, I have another one. I think there's still space for external linting and validation. Like, did you say that one? But linting, not validation. Linting, like, is this, not is it correct, but is it bad or is it good?
Okay, no, that's a good one. Yeah, because linting gets a little bit more into opinionation. Validation says, is this valid objects that you can pass in? Linting says, is this the right idea? Do you have the right things there? And here's a simple thing, right? We are currently working on labels and annotations to recommend that all your application Kubernetes objects have to do that. In fact, it's kind of held up on me tweaking some things in the PR out of a meeting last week to finish that off, hopefully. And then, so a validation tool would say, is your schema valid? Where a linting tool would say, hey, you're missing these labels that we recommend you have, kind of thing. And linting tools are going to be different depending, right, on your organization and the kinds of rules you have and the way you do things. A number of companies I know have talked about writing their own. but maybe a space that lets you have flexible rule engines and linting, like one of the YAML linters that I've used, which says pass in certain things and then we will validate the stuff based on your rules files. I don't know if we have something like that that really targets Kubernetes.
Yeah, and that's what I'm saying. And I know opinions, opinions are opinions. But I think there's a good set of defaults. And then as long as it allows extensibility, this could be a great tool for the ecosystem.
Let's see. No, that's a good one. Thank you. So one of the things that I'll talk about, and I know some folks have demoed some tools recently, like at KubeCon. I think the draft folks demoed something at KubeCon. So I'm going to say debugging tools. We need a better ability to debug things in those kinds of environments that we're running them in. Especially, if we were maybe writing it on a Mac, as so many people in the community are, and your POSIX environment is mildly different and your tool chain is slightly different, and then you go to run it inside of a container, say a Linux container. Now your underlying operating system and even, a whole lot in between is mildly different. And the ability to debug something that could be weird in two slightly different environments, being able to actually debug it inside of your container, running in your cluster or whatever, would be nice. And I know the draft folks have talked about it. And then there's telepresence, which recently demoed, which will help you with some of this. But figuring out good ways to debug stuff, I think it's still a weakness compared to the kinds of stuff I was using even 5-10 years ago in just other languages and other kinds of pre-cloud native setups. Matt Fisher, you were talking about, debugging for microservices. Squash, I had not seen that. Thank you, Matt. In chat, Matt Fisher shared something called Squash, which is debugging for microservices, which I had not seen.
Yeah, so Adit Levine, she's from a stealth startup called Solo, and she demoed this at KubeCon in Texas, actually. So there's a short session on this on Squash, but basically that's kind of like the idea that was inspired to build the draft debugging experience with VS Code and all that stuff at the last KubeCon in EU. I'm getting my cities mixed up right now. But basically, Squash was kind of the idea for doing this. Basically how it worked is that in the early versions of Squash, how it worked is that it ran a daemon set that basically attached a remote debugger, or at least a controller that would attach a remote debugger to your pod. So imagine if your pod is written in Go or your pod is something like that, it would attach a remote delve debugger, and basically VS Code would, through this plugin, it would basically go and attach through, I think it was Istio or Envoy was basically using the service mesh to connect to it. And that whole connection was going on. Now I know that they're doing some alpha stuff with Squash to make it client only, where they basically tunnel a connection to your pod, like kubectl port forward, and then attach a remote debugger that way, kind of like how Draft does right now, where you Draft Connect will do a local tunnel to your actual application, and then it'll attach a Delve remote debugger locally to you, and then actually do the whole debugging within an IDE. So I know there have been scenarios where some people are trying to solve this in certain ways, but I'm curious if there are any other scenarios that other people have come up with for debugging applications.
I don't know if they have. Draft was the first time I'd seen it because I missed the Squash presentation. So,
yeah, it's a fantastic demo. If you haven't seen it before, she does a really good deep dive into it. So it's a good session if you are interested in this topic. There has been some previous education and knowledge bombs dropped in previous KubeCons.
That's fantastic. Do we have any other tools that, while we're kind of listing things off, that others see as kind of a gap? Even if there's maybe only one thing that's in the market that's just starting out, or maybe you see gaps in the tool chains and what they do now, even if they touch on it. Are there anything else that people see or think?
The one thing that actually I did see and think about the limitations of Go in particular is that I believe you need a specific you need a very, I can't remember exactly what it was. It was like sysproc or something like that you need to attach inside of your Helm chart or inside of your Kubernetes manifest to basically to allow the remote debugger to attach and to connect to the local service, at least for draft. So there was that one limitation. I'm not 100% fully, like it's pre-coffee for me this morning. But I do recall that you had to modify your Kubernetes manifest. Yeah, sys ptrace, thank you. Thanks, yeah, Radu has more information on that. But that was one thing, that was a limitation of the current debuggers, that you needed that specific capability inside your container in order to connect and do a remote attach of the existing debuggers out there today.
Thank you. Did anybody have anything else on other tools? Or other gaps in just general tool chain stuff? Kim, did this kind of hit home with the kinds of questions you were hoping to get out of this conversation to see?
This was interesting. I like to hear about these new things and what people are using, and gaps, of course. We have a bunch of tools. They're not all quite tied together yet, but
yeah, and that's even kind of how it is in a lot of places in open source software and application stuff across the board. I've taken so many tools that were never thought of to work together and piece them together in Jenkins pipelines over time that it's kind of crazy. So along those lines, there was a second question of what internal tools have you built that no one knows about yet that you'd like to chat about? Is there anybody who wants to do that, or in the last couple minutes, or maybe think about it and get permission, and then in 2 weeks when we come back to talk about these developer things, you can say, ooh, this internal thing, I don't know whether I can, but I checked on it. We can talk about this neat thing. If you have something like that, think about it. We'll do that as maybe the talk to kick it off, the discussion next in 2 weeks. So that'll be June 11th. And we can do that then.
Yeah, the booking.com demo was really cool. I think that was a couple weeks ago. So I don't think that one is open source yet, but that just kind of sprung to mind when I was thinking of this.
Yeah, and one of the things that we did discover in the survey was a lot of people have built their own in-house tools. I'm actually kind of curious how much more so they've done with Kubernetes than with past platforms to know whether this is just a normal way they operate or if it's something specific to Kubernetes because of gaps. We are developers. We do like to write things.
I wanted to invite anyone who has an application that has decent end-to-end test already in place to reach out to me either on API Snoop or hh@iicoop on email. I would love to collect not just the API calls you're making to Kubernetes, but also all of the parameters and information so that we can prioritize and have data for our EDE test.
Yeah. I mean, part of this, for those of you who don't know what Hippie Hacker's up to, we are doing things like conformance testing and testing in Kubernetes. And one of the things is to try to exercise the APIs in real world ways. You know, what applications are exercising the APIs and in what ways, so then we can kind of see how are the APIs holding up and maybe create better tests and our better ability to figure out coverage and what we should be looking at and just how that's flexed. And so he's trying to gather information for a lot of that stuff. Does that sum it up well?
Yeah, it's I'm hoping that in addition to doing the conformance test, have a central place where for a particular API, if you wanted to see what other applications are using it and in what way they're using it, you'll have this central place to look that up as well as conformance. Thanks.
Thank you. All right. Well, thanks everyone for the discussion. And we've only got 3 minutes left. Did anybody have any last things they wanted to share in the last few minutes? Going once.
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly point out that I did put in the YouTube link to Edith Levine's talk from KubeCon Austin in chat.
Thank you. I will add that to the notes. All right. Well, if nobody has anything else other than that, then we can call it a week. And with that, everyone, have a wonderful week. We'll be back next week talking about more fun things. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks for hosting, Matt.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.